Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. It is exactly a minute to 9 a.m. We want to move on to the next segment, and this is all about family. Our family check segment today, we are going to be talking about trauma and how you can best manage trauma, be it that stems from your childhood or events that happen throughout life. We will be talking about that today, and we welcome you to be part of this conversation. Feel free to interact with us. Use the hashtag Good Morning Kenya on Twitter. Our official station handle is at KBC Channel 1. My handle is at Jain Wambui. I will be sampling your views as and when they do come in. Now, to help us with this conversation this morning, we have Eunice Menja, who is a professor of psychology, among many other titles that she bears. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning, Jain.
Thank you so much for making time to be with us. Now, let us start with Eunice Menja as an individual, as a professor, as a founder, among the many titles that you wear. But tell us a bit about yourself.
I am a simple woman. I grew up in Nyeri.
Yes.
And I went to school in Nyeri, and I also joined Jomo Kenyatta University before I went to the US, where I got my master's degree. And I am about to get my PhD on 22nd of July.
Congratulations.
I am a mother of two, and I'm also married to one husband. Yes, but I can talk about childhood trauma because I have experienced a lot of that. But I have been using that as my strength to help others cope with it.
All right.
Also impact children.
Now, you have founded Upendo Kids. Tell us a bit about this organization, its background and what it does.
Yes, so before I went to the US, I used to teach Sunday school in my church in Juja. And when I was leaving the day, actually, we had a farewell party. All the children were asking me, Teacher Eunice, when you go to the US, never forget us. And so when I went to the US, I decided that I wanted to do something small, but it actually ended up being huge. I found out that some of my friends or my children that I was teaching in Sunday school actually did not have homes. So I established a home. It is called Upendo Children's Home.
Yes.
Back in 2013, it is a home that caters for about 50 children, and we have 3 years to almost 19 years old because they graduate high school when they're still there.
All right.
Yes.
And how is it doing so far? Did it bring the change that you were hoping it would, and especially so given that it was focusing on children?
Yes. In terms of trauma, yes, because most of the practices that we do actually, even at Upendo, are trauma-informed care.
Yes.
We try to provide assistance and resources for those children to cope with trauma. Most of the children that we have rescued in the home have been traumatized, have gone through a lot of trauma, whether it is from abuse, physical abuse or sexual abuse, other trauma from just neglect, and other natural disasters as far as losing a family member. And so everything that we try to do at Upendo is usually trauma-informed, and we help those children cope with trauma. We have seen a lot of kids thrive.
Yes.
We do have children that have graduated high school. They have gone as far as national schools, and they're actually getting ready to go to university now.
Beautiful.
That is what care, love can do to children that have been traumatized.
All right.
Yes.
Now, this word trauma, it's the main focus of today's conversation, just how to manage trauma. But taking a step back to understand the word trauma in itself, what does it mean from a medical point of standing?
I will just use the simple language so that everybody can understand that trauma is any emotional response that a human being gives to address or react to something that has happened, and it has to be something unpleasant, like a stressor, death of a family member, even a natural disaster, like when you have, famine. People, develop ways of coping with that, and it can also be traumatic because of what people have to go through when there's no food. I want to say that we are going to be talking about COVID trauma for a long time because of its long-term effect. And so anything that your body does, your brain does, the behavior that you have to respond to that stressor is what trauma is all about.
All right.
Yes.
Now, you've touched on some of the causes that are known when it comes to trauma, looking at these natural disasters, COVID-19, a pandemic that nobody could prepare for. But let's take a step back and look at children. And we're living in a time where people always say, hey, childhood trauma is real. When you talk about childhood trauma, where exactly does it stem from?
Actually, now that you've talked about, for the last 2 weeks, we have actually been going around the country. I want to not really around the country, but in Kiambu County to talk about childhood trauma. And I want to say that because the reason why I'm saying that is because my research was actually looking at children that have gone through sexual abuse. I did my research at Thika Level 5 Hospital, and I was dealing with victims that had just been sexually abused. And what I found out is that there's a lot of trauma. Those children are living with trauma, and it has to be intervened for them to actually not deal with that trauma in later in life. And so when you talk about childhood trauma, it emanates from a lot of things: child abuse, sexual abuse, deprivation, threats that are caused by parents. But I want to say that parents do not necessarily want to harm their children. They don't want to cause that trauma. It is because themselves have not dealt with their own trauma.
Now, parents.
Yes.
Parents. I mean, there's no manual as to how you can be a parent.
Yes.
But what is it that, as a parent, that we do knowingly or unknowingly that could actually be a form of trauma to our children in the long run? That, of course, you're doing it, maybe doing it with pure intention, but psychologically speaking and emotionally speaking, it is a form of abuse to the children.
So the most common one is physical abuse. And what happens is that we have been socialized to use physical punishment as a form of discipline, which is not always the best form of discipline for a lot of children. Children that are, depending on their predisposition, because all of us are wired differently. Any type of threat to a child is going to result to trauma. We can talk about just spanking. There are children that are going to face spanking as something, fun. Other people are going to be just harden themselves. Others are just going to be, every time they see someone holding a cane, they are going to just fear. And so what that does is that the body starts to resort to always wanting to fight. For example, like when you're walking down the street and you find you come across a lion, and what does your body does? The physiological response that your brain activates, of course, I'm not going to talk about a lot of jargon, but there's a part of your body that is supposed to respond to that stressor. So you engage your body to where it actually tenses up. And when you tenses up, what happens is that your blood pressure is also going higher, your heart rate is going higher. Now, there's something that we also call cortisol. Cortisol. Yeah, maybe you've heard about cortisol level. It rises to where it's supposed to be. Yes, it's normal. I'm fighting this lion, and I know it's going to go away. But when you fight that lion with your body physiologically, and that lion doesn't go away, it actually leads to trauma. There are 3 types of trauma. So when a child is continually threatened, when a child is continually facing that lion, a lion could be domestic violence. Your dad comes home every day and fights your mom, or even beats everybody. Or maybe your teachers are beating you at school every time because of no reason. That's a lion that doesn't go. So your body is constantly fighting that threat. And so what happens is that every part of your organ is going to be subdued to a lot of stress.
The stress hormone.
The stress hormones. So the cortisol level is not normal when it actually being produced often in your body. This small body is going to be poisoned by cortisol level, and it's going to affect your heart.
So trauma doesn't necessarily have to be direct. It can also be by association and by what we see, not necessarily a physical act that has been meted against an individual or the victim.
Yes, it doesn't have to be direct, doesn't have to be physical, it can be emotional. So when your mom is being beaten every night, like that was my case when I was growing up, I was tensed. I wanted to fight this lion that came home to fight my father every day, but I couldn't, because I'm a child. What I do is I numb my body and I freeze my body, and there are so many things that are going on biologically that are actually going to harm you in the long run.
Now, let's talk about some of those most common responses that we tend to, or rather our bodies tend to resort to without necessarily us being in control. The flight, fight, or freeze response. Tell us a bit about them.
Okay.
And does age have a role to play in this?
It does. So as a child, as I said, I'm going to use the same example of a lion. So we cannot fight lions. So what we do is, if you can't run away, which is the flight, you're going to prepare your body to fight that lion, but you're not going to be able to do that. So if you cannot be able to do that, you're going to freeze. Your body is going to be numb. But when your body is being numb, you're so tensed, you are sweating. As I said, your heart rate is going very, very fast. That is very, very dangerous. So when people are bullying, children are being bullied at school, or if maybe anywhere, maybe in the streets, or in the US, we have a lot of bullying, especially cyberbullying. There are children that are having to deal with that every day. And as you grow older, your body is not able to actually, the mechanism of fighting stress is actually deprived. So what happens is that you are actually, your body is becoming more tensed, depression is going to arise, and then people have, that's when we talk about people are dealing with mental illness. So untreated trauma, unintervened trauma causes depression.
All right.
And yes.
Now, this is a conversation all about managing trauma. We are at this particular point where we're talking about the responses that our bodies tend to resort to. But before we get deeper into that, we want to catch a very quick breather, but we'll be back to continue with this discussion. Do stay with us. Welcome back. We continue with our conversation today on Family Check, all about managing trauma. And with us still in studio is Eunice Menja, who is a psychology professor. Now, picking up from where we left off, when it comes to the responses that our bodies resort to, depending on the situation, we have talked a bit about freezing, the mechanism that it comes. Now, when it comes to flight and fight, what triggers these parts of our brains to react this way?
So when you're talking about trauma, anything can trigger trauma.
Okay.
And of course, through the 5 senses that we have, it can be you just maybe smell the perfume of the person that sexually abused you. Maybe you're walking around some flowers that you see, and maybe those are the flowers probably you used even to lay on your mom's grave and things like that. It can be things that people say, photos that we see, or even watching something on like a movie that reminds you about what you have experienced before. Remember, trauma is about an unpleasant experience that you have experienced, life experience that was very, very difficult for you. It must have been painful for it to resort to trauma. So anything can trigger. Like I said, if you have, even when you grow older, for example, you were working in an office like you, and you have a colleague that actually looks like a teacher that really spanked you so hard it resorted to abuse, or even somebody who actually, bullied you. That is going to trigger trauma. So trauma can be triggered by anything, things that we say, and that's why we have to inform and sensitize the society to be aware of trauma and what it can do to somebody's brain, so that we can actually provide resources instead of re-traumatizing people.
Because that's what normally happens, like you're told, hey, kangumu, ni life. Now, so this takes me back to the different types and or other categories that are when it comes to trauma. Take us through that.
So one single event of a traumatic event would result to an acute trauma. If you continue to experience that event over and over, for example, you lose your father, your mom dies, your cousin dies, and things like that, so it is adding up to more stressors, more traumatic events, so that actually results to chronic trauma. I'm giving you an example of everybody in the country has gone through COVID-19. Besides COVID-19, maybe I lost a loved one through COVID-19. You know, the isolation and all those things can be traumatic. And so because of that compounding effect of different types of trauma, it causes chronic trauma. Complex trauma is when those compounded traumatic events are continuous and there's no intervention that is provided. So, for example, maybe you actually get maybe sexually abused. You get married to somebody who is violent to you, and experience domestic violence. Besides that, maybe you lose a child through domestic violence, maybe through miscarriage and things like that. So there's a lot of it's not just complex, it's also continuous. It's actually like a cycle that is not breaking. So that results to
so there's acute, chronic, and complex. Complex.
Yes.
All right. Now, looking at stats, it indicates that every 6 in 10 men and 5 in every 10 women experiences one form or more of trauma throughout their life. Is trauma inevitable?
Trauma is not inevitable, and it's not the trauma that actually is harmful. It is the lack of intervention. Because
that
all
becomes
of us
a major problem.
Becomes major problem. All of us at one particular point, like I have said, COVID-19, nobody escaped COVID-19. We were looking at the numbers. I was living in the US during COVID-19. We lost close to 1 million people. Actually, more than 1 million people died. Some of them are my friends. So trauma is not inevitable. It's how you deal with that trauma after that. So I'm going to talk about 4 R's. We call them 4 R's. And 1 R is recognizing that you have gone through trauma. So just being aware that I have gone through a death. I recently went through a death because my mom died. That is trauma. I have to make sure that I label that as trauma. I cannot just, say, well, everybody dies, something happened, I'm going to forget about it. What do I do to make sure that I deal with that? I also have to, I talked about recognize, and also being able to respond to that. So what is my response that provides me with the resilience? Whether it is going to join a grief, support system where I can be talking about the memories of my mom. I can talk about how my mom was loving, instead of just dealing with that grief and not talking about it. So there's also, of course, as I talked about, building resilience, and of course making sure that everybody is aware about what not to do. When I talk about domestic violence, I'm very passionate because I experienced firsthand domestic violence as a child, and we don't recognize that children go through domestic violence, but there are things that trigger me when I'm older right now, and my husband knows about it. You cannot bang a door inside my house because it traumatizes me. It brings back those memories. So what I'm trying to tell people is that when you're working with children especially, just be aware that there could be something that you're doing and you're not doing it intentionally. You're doing you're loving on them, but just threatening that child or saying, I'm gonna beat you up, I'm going to, I'm gonna spank you, I'm gonna withdraw food from you. Maybe that child went through a dry spell where there's no food, and then you say, I'm going to withdraw food from you because you're misbehaving. That can be very traumatic. So just being aware, and also making policies that are trauma-informed. I was just going through, the other day I was going through about the child welfare reform in this country, and it took me aback, because I was like, I hope they have considered that not just taking these children back to where they came from, it could also be another way of triggering trauma. Because what if you are saying that because this child has been living in a children's home and was sexually abused, and I'm going now to reunite them with their parents, the same family, the same house where they were sexually abused, what is that going to do to their brain? So they're constantly going to be gearing their body to fight that, because it's a threat that is not going to go away. It's the lion. You're taking the child back into the lion's den. So what does that look like as that child grows up? Because if I grow up as a tense child and I'm traumatized, I'm probably going to traumatize my children because I haven't dealt with that trauma. And so that's what we have to be aware as therapists, as professors, as teachers. Whether you're a Sunday school teacher or not, you have to be trauma informed so that you can take care of the little babies that you're taking care of. Trauma comes from just neglecting a child. Even an infant can be traumatized. Think about when you leave a baby to just cry and say, well, let them cry and sleep. That is not enough, because what is going to happen to that child is that child is not going to trust you, is not going to trust any adult. So every time they're just going to be thinking about neglect. People don't like me. I can't trust adults. They don't care about me. They don't want to feed me. They don't want to change me my diapers. So that is causing trauma, because every time that child is crying, what is rising up? The cortisol level. And it is present in every human being.
Now, looking at trauma, it mostly takes a big toll on our mental well-being, our psychological well-being.
Yes.
And looking at the studies that have been done, is there a genetic predisposition that might put an individual at a higher risk of going through a traumatic response to something that may not have a direct link to them?
Yes, there is. So our genes are very important. We talk about nature and as well as nurture. Nature is how your brain is wired. That depends on your DNA. And even the person that actually gave birth to you. Because, for example, if you're a pregnant woman that is undergoing through a lot of stress, that stress can actually be transmitted to the child that is growing up. So what happens is that even the child that is in the womb is also knowing how to cope with stress. But what is happening is that the brain is being wired to always give up that cortisol. So the cortisol level is going up high. We usually test it on the tongue of an infant who has just been born, and you just take that the cortisol level. It might actually be the same as the mom, because it has actually been transmitted. So also even how your brain actually reacts to stress, there's something that we call HPA, hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis. That is actually the kitchen cabinet of your stress relief in your body. It tells your body when to release that cortisol level. So depending on how your actually DNA is, you might actually be the person that is always reacting to stress in a very, very aggressive way. Because there are people that are going to remain calm. Have you ever been in a matatu and the matatu is almost about to hit something and everybody is screaming? It is because we are all wired different. Some people are going to scream, some people are just going to hold on to, some people are just going to say a cursive word or something like that. But because of how you have been wired, it can actually determine how your body is going to be dealing with stress for the rest of your life.
All right.
Yes.
Now, on Twitter, there's a lady or a gent, I'm not too sure who that in the image is, but their handle is recover_your. They go on to say, RIP to all the opportunities I missed because I was stuck in survival mode. Now, this brings me to the signs and symptoms that point to trauma that we might not be alive to. What are some of those signs that could be telling us, yo, you are dealing with trauma, but you don't know you are?
And a lot of time is sadness. I mean, just looking at somebody, sometimes a lot of us just live with sadness that we cannot help. It's just sad because we are remembering, we are having those flashbacks. There's something that we call PTSD that we haven't talked about, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's actually going to leave people very, very sad. You're always in a very bad mood because you have experienced something that is very traumatic. Some people just remain numb. You can go to a classroom and actually just observe children there, and you're going to find some kids that are just actually disassociated from the environment because they are dealing with trauma. So other things like just fatigue. There are people that are always going to be feeling tired. It is because their body is actually dealing with that trauma. So the mechanism of fighting the trauma is actually making them so tired. And also even people that are very sickly all the time, especially children. Sometimes we worry why a certain child is always sick.
Yeah.
But I want to even challenge the doctors in this country. When a child comes to your room every day because of a certain sickness, do you mind to ask them about what is going on at home? There's something that we also call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences that could be actually going on, and those ones have been actually associated with a lot of illnesses. Childhood illnesses. A child is always coughing, a child is always having bronchitis, or because their immune system is actually being depleted because of how their body is always fighting stress. It's constantly fighting.
Yeah.
So what happens is that their immune system go down and the child is always sick. I mean, even you as an employer or as a boss, if you have people calling in the office all the time, you might want to be trained to be trauma informed so that you can actually understand what is going on in your office, because it's not just because it's cold. Other people could be exposed to that cold cold germs because of just their immune system, and it's a result of trauma.
And looking at the recent times, depression and anxiety have been on an upward rise.
Yes.
And could this also be not just a mental illness, but also a response to, for example, the pandemic that we have been going through and the ripple effect from job losses, financial income streams cut off? Is that also one of the major trauma responses?
Yes. In psychology, there's something that we always talk about, the window of tolerance. We all have a certain window of tolerance that God has given us. That is when we are saying, we can bounce back, we're resilient. But when you come out of that window, anything can happen. It's like, have you ever tried to put so much air in a balloon that it just burst? It is because the trauma, your body cannot hold that trauma anymore. And so what happens, especially for men, because they don't talk about it, they look for a way out. And the way out is to deal with this trauma permanently, and they end up committing suicide. I mean, just recently, the university where I went to, Jomo Kenyatta University, we just lost 2 students the other day, and one of the students actually committed suicide because she couldn't hold the pain of not graduating. That is trauma. It could be something that actually came from, her childhood, dealing with trauma, and to a certain level that it's the limit, because, we are just like that balloon or something elastic. You can only pull it for too long.
Can only expand.
You can only expand it for too long. But, when it gives up, it's going to give up. And that's when people start having, people have a mental breakdown. People just, are having suicide ideation, and they are going to talk about, I want to end this pain because it's too much. And that's why we have to really, really consider intervention.
All right. Now, speaking of interventions, life happens and it will throw at you anything and everything, at your workplace, at your school, at your home. There could be all these triggers that are not necessarily within your control as the individual, but how do you learn to cope and manage through and walk yourself through these triggers without them throwing you off balance that you have sort of established?
Yeah, and because I'm not gonna give like it's not white it's not white and black.
Yeah,
because everybody's trauma is different. Some people deal with the death of a pet just like I would deal with the death of a human being, somebody that I love. So what I usually say is that you have really to be self-aware. Just be aware of yourself, be aware of your environment, And most of the times what I do with even my students, or even sometimes when I'm doing counseling, because I do counseling, I usually tell people, have you identified some of those trauma triggers that are actually causing you to start having flashbacks of events that happened? So what you need to do is write down what are some of the things that are actually causing you to have a lot of anxiety, and also being able to deal with them. I don't tell people to isolate themselves or, you know, run away from those triggers, because it is impossible. It's very impossible to run away with those things we talked about there, inevitable. It's definitely one thing that I usually say: we have to embrace counseling, we have to embrace therapy as a country. I know that when I look at even some of the charges that counselors ask for or therapists ask for, they're unimaginable for a lot of people in this country. But I would consider, you know, just even talking to your youth pastor, even talking to your church elder, your friends, joining grief support systems where you can talk about your trauma, because if you don't deal with your trauma, you're probably going to be dealing with a lot of other things like illnesses, high blood pressure, diabetes, cancer, because they are all going to be associated with the amount of trauma that is in your body. Yeah, so you have to be self-aware and also reach out for help. Exercise is known to be very good because it actually activates some of those parts of the brain that help you to calm down. So exercise is one good thing. Then it's
feel good hormones come in place. Dopamine, shot of dopamine into your body.
No, don't use substance abuse.
No, when you exercise. Yes. When you exercise, you get the feel good hormones.
Yes.
All right. Now, there's a tweet that has come in here. It reads, it took a few years of trauma therapy before my frozen body started waking up. What I mean is, I had no idea of how disembodied I was for most of my life until trauma therapy made me feel safe enough to be in my body. When it comes to treatment options or avenues to address trauma or traumatic events.
Yeah. So one of the most common or the best that is known, psychotherapy treatment is called CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. What that means is that you have to actually apply your thinking process. To understand what is making that behavior appear or occur. So when you apply both thinking and the behavioral change, is going to actually help you to deal with your trauma faster. So it has been used for a lot of things, even for people who have a drug addiction, and teaching people to actually develop other behavioral patterns that are not allowing them to go through that trauma again. So for example, if you're thinking about things that are always sad because maybe your parent died, and we tend to think about that because it's a sad thing to lose a parent. So maybe think about 5 positive things that are happening in your life. Sometimes you use the 5 senses, just looking outside. What can you see with your eyes? What can you listen? Maybe some calm music, some gospel music that is helping you to relax. Even touching. Sometimes we talk about it's as simple as this. You can use gravity to actually calm your body down. And that means that even if you go and just purchase a very heavy blanket that you can lay on yourself, and I'm imagining because of this July weather, the weighted blanket. For children, we use other things like even toys. We use sand. Children that have sexually been abused, you can give them things that are perfect. Something like animals, I don't know what you call those. Those cloth toys.
The stuffed animals?
The stuffed animals, yes.
There we go.
See, we're helping each other. Yes, the stuffed animals, so that they can actually hold on to them, because that provides them some type of assurance, some type of safety. And even adults, just talk about it. If you're a woman, because women like to call a girlfriend and talk about it.
Talking therapy.
There is no real, even laugh. There's people are using laughter as therapy. I don't know if you've heard about that. They use it in cancer centers where they actually just provide ways for people to laugh because it helps your body actually calm down and even getting rid of those negative thoughts.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, just to address some questions that have come in, somebody is asking, is survival mode a trauma response?
It is,
and it's something that we casually say,
yes.
Misa iniko survival mode.
It's a trauma response. We see it a lot, especially with adults. Adults, when adults are hurt and they're not talking about it and they're not seeking therapy, they're going to say, I'm just coping. Okay, that is survival mode, that you are ignoring what has happened, but it's not helpful because you are only going to escape that trauma or that traumatic experience for just a very short time. Because once a trigger comes, it might actually be the one that triggers your brain to actually have a mental breakdown. So it's not good to survive. Just reach out for help.
All right.
Yeah.
Then there's somebody else who says, sometimes the only way to heal is to finally walk into the burning building and put out the flames, even if that means you get burnt in the process. Healing from pain is painful. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that's what I'm doing with my life right now. When I go in front of women that have been abused, have gone through domestic violence, and I give my story, whether I go to those children that I'm talking about, even at Upendo, or even working with children when I was doing my research, and actually telling them my experiences so that they can tell me their experiences. Because as she said, yes, you have to be in that fire sometimes to put off the fire. Sometimes it's standing up for yourself. If you are in going through a traumatic experience because of what you're experiencing right now, you might have to even stand up, even if it means that somebody is gonna, harm you and tell you to, you don't have a right. But speak up for yourself and also fight for other people. I find a lot of healing, a lot of therapy when I'm fighting for children and when I'm fighting for other victims, because I feel like I am being part of a solution.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
Greater good.
Now, finally, somebody says it's okay if who you are isn't everyone else's cup of tea. You are still worthy, valuable, and amazing, just as you are.
That's very important. Self-esteem is very, very important when it comes to people who have been going through trauma. It is the only way to heal, because once you have self-esteem, self-confidence, you are going to reach out for the best resources for yourself.
Now, as we close this conversation, just in very, very few words, your message to everyone who's watching us today, there's your camera, when it comes to how we perceive trauma and manage it, very briefly.
So what I can say is that for yourself, personally, you have to, actually the things we have talked about, recognize that there's trauma, and also realize that there are ways for you to ask for help and seek out for those help, and also help the people that are around you. Don't be the reason why people are actually re-experiencing trauma. Provide resources, support, a shoulder to cry on, and above all, we know that God is always loving. Ask for His grace to help you cope.
All right. Eunice Menja, she is a professor of psychology, soon graduating with her PhD. Congratulations on that. Thank you so much for making time to be with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
All right. That brings us to a close of the program. Thank you for your time. Be sure to join us again tomorrow morning right here on KBC Channel 1 for another fantastic edition of Good Morning Kenya. My name is Jain. Do enjoy the rest of your viewing.